My applesauce spice dump cake recipe is easy and delicious. With abundant notes of cinnamon and cloves, this version of apple cobbler has only 3 base ingredients, making it perfect for beginner cooks. Let's get started. For a 9x13 baking dish, you will need 48 ounces of applesauce. I'm using regular sweetened, one 15.25 ounce box of spice cake mix, and 2 sticks of butter. I'm using unsalted, but you could definitely use salted if you want. Like I said, you only need 3 ingredients, but if you want to take your dessert to the next level, I also recommend adding a 1/4 cup of light brown sugar, as I measure 60 grams, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, half a teaspoon of cinnamon, a 1/4 teaspoon of ginger, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt. I already buttered my 9x13 baking dish with some of the butter over there, so I'm ready to go. But before I get started, I'm going to put my butter back into the refrigerator just to make sure it stays warm. You'll see why this is important later on in the video. As the name suggests, the first step in making my applesauce spice dump cake is literally just dumping the applesauce into the pan. So like I said, it's already buttered. So I'm just going to take my applesauce and literally just pour it into the baking dish. Then I'm going to take a spoon and even it out as evenly as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just try to smooth the applesauce layer out as much as possible. If you're only using the 3 base ingredients, you can go on to the next step, but since I'm adding the extras, I'm going to do that now. Like I said, 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. So I'm going to sprinkle that over the top. I know you might be thinking, hey Chef Parnell, why are we adding lemon juice to applesauce or just to a recipe with apples in general? That's because I almost always add lemon juice and or zest to my desserts that have fruit in them, like apple cobbler, blueberry cobbler, things like that, because I think it helps to bring out the fruit flavor. I know I've taught this to some of my followers and they've started doing it and they like it, so I recommend it. Now for the sugar, actually, no, I'm going to go with the spices. Now, honestly, I don't think the order matters that much, but I add a little bit of extra spice. I know I am using spice cake mix, so this is probably very optional, but I'm still gonna add a little bit just to add more flavor, because unlike apple pie filling, applesauce usually does not have any spices in it unless you get cinnamon applesauce or something like that. I'm just gonna add my spices like this. Nice and easy. Now for the 1/4 cup of light brown sugar. The canned pie filling probably has a little bit of brown sugar in it, and just in general, I find applesauce to not be quite as sweet as pie filling, so I'm going to add a little bit of extra sugar even though this is unsweetened applesauce, just because I think that brown sugar and apples go together, so I always add a little bit to my apple pies and cobblers. Sprinkling it over evenly as possible. And for the salt, it's another ingredient you might be saying, Chef Parnell, why are we adding salt to this? It's just to help balance out the flavors a little bit. I add a little bit of salt to all of my desserts, so a little bit will go a long way. Now that the applesauce filling layer is done, it's time to move on to the cake mix. So like I said, I have my 15.25 ounce box of spice cake mix, and I'm literally just going to shake it over the top like this. If you don't have spice cake mix, you could definitely use white or yellow. If you want to turn it into a spice cake mix, you could probably add the spice and then gently mix it in when you break up the lumps like I'm going to do in the next step. I think this spice cake mix is going to add a lot of flavor, and it's going to make this different from other dump cakes. Now I'm going to take my fork, and without mixing, I'm just going to drag it across the top to break up the big lumps. By doing this, I'm also spreading it out a little more evenly. But like I said, you do not want to mix. A dump cake has distinct layers, so even though it may be tempting to start mixing, it is not what you want to do. You just want to spread out the cake mix across the top as evenly as possible. The cake mix layer is now done, so I'm preheating my oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit as I put on the butter. This is the most time-consuming part of making a dump cake, but it's also the most important. So I'm just going to take my butter here, and I am just going to take my knife, and I'm going to cut it into small pieces like this, and I'm going to lay those pieces across the top. I would say probably 4 to 6 slices per tablespoon, so you want to make them pretty thin, like I'm doing here. And you want to space them maybe 1/8 of an inch apart. Something like that. I know this looks very tedious and time consuming, but it's very important because as the butter melts in the oven, it's going to sink down and out and through the cake mix, and it's going to turn it into a delicious crumble topping that is going to be absolutely amazing. It's going to have a great texture too. So you want this butter to spread out and moisten all of the cake mix. That's why you want these little pads of butter, because if you have big pads of butter, as they melt, they're going to go down but not out as much. So you're going to have a lot of the dump cake that's still dry. I know some people have talked about melting the butter and then putting it or pouring it over the top like that, and you can do that, but it's a lot easier to miss parts of the dump cake when you do that. And if they don't get butter on them when you pour it over, they're probably not going to get any during the baking, so that part of the cake mix is going to turn out dry. It's not what you want. I've heard of people maybe, or this was suggested, maybe freezing the butter and then grating it, or shredding it in a, well, grating, yeah, in a food processor. You could try that. If someone tries that, let me know how it turns out, but I think this, even though it's tedious, might be the best way to do it. So if someone comes up with another way of doing this, please let me know, but like I said, I think this might be the best. Put a bit of extra there. So I'm going to finish this as my oven is preheating, and then I'll bring you back. I just finished laying the pads of butter across the top of the dump cake. I have just 1 tablespoon of butter left, so almost all the 2 sticks. Over here, I felt like there was a little more space between the slices of butter than I would have liked, so I just went back and added some smaller pieces to fill in the gaps. Now I'm going to put my dump cake into a 350 degree oven, uncovered. I'll let you know for how long. I just pulled my applesauce spice dump cake out of the oven. It was in at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, uncovered for 60 minutes, 1 hour. It looks and smells fantastic. As you can see, my cobbler looked fantastic. The crust was perfectly golden brown with bits of the filling poking up around the edges. I let it cool for about 30 to 45 minutes, then I dove in. And when I cut the first slice and took the first bite, I knew that my old-fashioned applesauce spice dump cake was a big success because it was absolutely delicious. First, let's talk about how it tasted. The spices were the dominant flavor with a hint of apple in the background that helped to tone them down just enough. The crumble had a pleasant butteriness as well that made this dish even better. In fact, I shared this dessert with a group of people and everyone said that it, quote, tasted like fall, and honestly, I think that's the perfect way to describe it. The cinnamon, the nutmeg, and cloves came through strong, but not too strong, similar to how a pumpkin pie allows the spices to really shine without letting them overwhelm your palate. So like I said, this tasted great. The texture was good as well. The applesauce filling was smooth and creamy while the crust was crunchy and crumbly, creating a very nice texture contrast. The texture of the filling itself was different than most dump cakes. It was looser and more watery than pie filling, but that's not necessarily a bad thing if you like applesauce. Just like with the flavor, the applesauce played a supporting role, and the main texture of this was the crispy, crumbly spice cake mix crumble topping. And in addition to looking good and tasting great, this smelled fantastic as well. I know that I can't transmit how this smelled through YouTube, but trust me, it definitely smelled like the spices that were in the cake mix. It definitely tasted and smelled like fall. In short, I really liked how this applesauce dump cake turned out, but there are a few things to consider if you make this recipe. First of all, I think that the spices are absolutely critical in this recipe because, like I already explained, they are what give this dessert most of its flavor. That's why I think using a spice cake mix is a much better idea than using a white or yellow cake mix. I'm not saying you can't, but if you do use a more neutral flavored cake mix, you're going to have to add a lot of extra spices. Just guessing, I would say maybe 2 tablespoons of pumpkin pie spice, something like that. But like I said, if you use white or yellow cake mix, do not forget to add the extra spices, because if you don't, I honestly think you would be kind of disappointed with this. I also wanted to comment on the apple flavor. Although it was definitely there, it was in the background, like I already explained, because the spices took center stage. And I think that the applesauce just in itself doesn't have as much flavor as apple pie filling does, or making a dump cake with fresh fruit. So if you really love apple flavor, you might want to substitute 2 21-ounce cans of apple pie filling for the applesauce. I think that recipe would turn out great. But like I said, if you want to focus on the spices, then go ahead and use the applesauce. And lastly, in regards to sweetness, I thought that this was just about right, but the applesauce filling itself could have been a little bit sweeter. Although I used sweetened applesauce and I did add some light brown sugar to it, it still wasn't quite as sweet as a normal dump cake is with pie filling or with canned fruit or something like that. So if you really like a sweet dump cake, you might want to add some extra sugar, maybe an extra 1/4 cup of light brown sugar. But then again, applesauce is just inherently less sweet than pie filling is, so you might just have to accept that this is not as sweet as a normal dump cake. Those comments aside, I was still really pleased with how my old-fashioned applesauce spice dump cake turned out. If you're looking for a dessert other than something pumpkin flavored that showcases fall spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, or cloves, this is one you need to make. It would be great for a holiday like Thanksgiving, Christmas, or any day. If you make it, I know you'll like it. As always, thanks for watching.